Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Hattin, fought on July the 4th, 1187. Possibly the most important battle of the what we call conventionally Crusader era, also the greatest Muslim victory of the period that effectively led to the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem after the battle and the siege of the city. Was a major blow for the Ottoman states, and that would eventually disappear, at least on the Asian coast, in 1291 with the fall of Acre. Today we want to trace, as always, a tactical history of the battle, right, with minimizing the strategic background that is naturally important and it enters in the battle. We will deal with it. But I can tell you, I already made a video on the Battle of Cresson, of the Springs of Cresson, that was fought in May of the same year, and that was particularly important also for preparing certain, the strategic context of in which the Battle of Hattin would have been fought. So you can check that video out. I have a playlist on Crusader War and Crusades in general. There are also references to certain units. For example, we talk about the Turcopoles. If you're interested, I made an entire video on them, so without repeating myself, you know where you can find more information, aside if you want to find it on Schwerpunkt specifically. So this battle is very fascinating for all a series of reasons, right? The battle is of, I would say, both great strategic and tactical significance, and given that this is, in fact, as we have said, a tactical analysis, we will observe why this is the case, because this is a battle that, I don't know, I must confess I'm not an expert on Crusader states, Crusading warfare. I study medieval warfare, as you know, but I don't know why the Crusades never actually caught my full attention, but of course I heard much of this battle. I've also read, effectively, a couple of things about it, and yet up to now, I would say these moments in which I had to prepare the video, I hadn't realized, albeit not having studied the sources directly, that this is actually a very thought-provoking clash about, first of all, as most of the times, especially in this specific times, like we're in the late 12th century, I mean, we're not very well informed about how battles were developed from a tactical point of view. Most of sources are relatively scanning. We have a few amount of information. You can easily see it in those other Crusades battles that we have commented, like Cresson or Ramla, the first battle, the second battle of Ramla. And there is here especially a great deal to learn about the confrontation of, in fact, crusading and Muslim forces on the usual comparison between the two types, especially of cavalry, right? I'm a great stressor, let's say, of the relative symmetry that existed between Christian and Muslim units. I mean, Frankish, let's put it in this way better. In this case, the Ayyubid units, in the sense that these are not times in which there is a massive difference. In pre-industrial times, it's actually armies are very, very similar in many regards. But this battle, I had remembered and heard it chiefly as, like the Christians were simply annihilated, wiped out. It was not even a battle, but a butchery. Well, it's nothing like that, right? And it was very close fought till the end, right? Where the outcome, by being surely very important and great Islamic victory, also shows actually the resilience of Frankish armies and their capabilities on the field, even on extreme conditions as these could be, right? So extreme, in fact, that even just the setting of the battle, theater of the battle was a hellish scenario, right? Because this battle was fought, if anything, on July the 4th. In this area, today's Israel, where I checked actually yesterday what's the average temperature on July the 4th in those lands. I can tell you that the minimal temperature 26 degrees centigrade, right, and the maximum being 42 on average, right? Naturally, we don't know which temperature was at that point specifically, precisely, but we can assume it was terrible. The whole deal, as we will see now, this battle is the strategic condition of the Crusader army that had made this push fundamentally from Acre and this base of Safaria to Tiberias that was being besieged by Saladin's forces. In this ground that was dotted just with a few points, with a few springs, for which we are called, even the Battle of Cresson was fought, in fact, in that regard. The springs of Cresson, the springs of Hattin, right, that were basically the only spots where large armies like these, because these were pretty large in this battle, could satisfy their thirst, essentially, and that therefore obliged the Crusader army, specifically here in crossing from Turan to Hattin in these 2 days without sufficient water, and being also harassed by the Saracen army that lightened up fires, and pushing, also favored by a wind that went from the west rather than the east, as it's more usual in that season, that specific area. In conditions that are of utter, it's unbelievable, right? And that gives more credit to the Franks, to the Muslims as well, because actually the other narrative is that Saladin was like playing cat with mice, but actually the Saracen army was pretty damn good as well. Like, they were suffering in the same way. Like, I would like to make you understand here that the logistical problems of armies of tens of thousands of men and animals, right? Because horses need an astonishing amount of water every single day, right? Here show you actually the capacities of medieval armies that were absolutely not inferior by the slightest to the one of previous times, and that the outcome of this battle is all to be given, at the time, was all but given for granted. Right? Naturally, the Saracens had substantial advantages that were very, very good at exploiting, though, but the Crusaders fought in a way that really put the same Saladin in difficulty. And also, as always, we don't know very much what happened exactly from a tactical point of view. I mean, we realize more or less what the 3 divisions of each army were doing, but we don't know literally everything they did along the way, right? And the distances are fairly short. I will put here most of the time this map that makes you understand, flashes all the picture of this battlefield is very, very interesting. And that, in fact, it's not a desert, right? What also I would like to make you understand from the logistical point of view is that large armies like these naturally were, in difficulty in a place where, it was terribly hot, and, it was a challenge for the time to put in motion all that amount of troops. But even in a place that was rich of water, actually the logistical difficulties were immense, right? And you don't need a desert to die of thirst if you want to keep an army, intact. And that was the enormous deal of this battle. That makes you understand really the intelligence, the courage, and the strength from both sides was really, really amazing. So I would start talking chiefly about the composition of the armies, that in part is also conjectural, right? And I don't want to focus too long on it, because that's not the important thing. It can maybe even confuse you. But the Ayyubid army was basically composed of troops that had been called by Saladin and his dependents and family from Syria, Mardin, Nizibin, Diyarbakir, other neighboring regions of what is now southeastern Turkey, plus Mosul and Erbil in northern Iraq. And at the beginning of the operations, that by the end of June was encamped around Tal Ashtara. So, what was the strategic deal of Saladin? Well, the war basically broke out with this excuse fact that Reynald of Chatillon, so this Jerusalemitan vassal, had assaulted a caravan directed to Egypt, right? And that was taken as a casus belli. And Saladin had started this first, reconnaissance, from which also the battle of Cresson would emerge, would stem. There was all the problem within the Crusader states that didn't within the Kingdom of Jerusalem, that fundamentally didn't want to this war, because it was a major threat. Like, Saladin was here committing basically his entire forces. He had shortly come out of an illness that made him consider what his fate also was really his destiny as a commander, as a leader of Islam, who was, and it was at that point or never, basically, to capture Jerusalem, right? And he assembled this massive army that basically lured, as it was normal at the time to do, the enemy army by essentially besieging some center. This center was Tiberias, as we will see on the homonymous lake, and this was the trap. Was a trap, of course, in the sense that the Crusaders perfectly knew what the deal was, but that's how strategy largely worked at the time. It revolved around these blockades around cities and armies coming to essentially break them. That's the medieval warfare, medieval strategy in a nutshell, most of the times. So naturally, Saladin wanted a major battle, right, in which to crush the army of Jerusalem and to eventually march on and seize the city, right? So what we have to understand in here, that you don't have to fall in the idea, okay, this was a trap, the Crusaders fell for it, because historiography is always very colorful and tells a lot of stories of the the conflicts that existed indeed within the same Crusader states, as much as under the Muslims, but Saladin's domains were, always, every domain, every power at this point was very unstable, right, by definition, because the permanent and centralized structures were basically almost non-existent, and finding the resources and committing with all the moral strengths for these operations was an enterprise of striking immense difficulty, right? That only big, capable leaders like Saladin or others were effectively capable of doing. Saladin also feared, conversely, that a new crusade would be launched, effectively the same Battle of Hattin in a way triggered the Third Crusade, right? So that also created problems to the same Ayyubids. But the point here is that it's simple as that. Like, Saladin was besieging Tiberias, right, and waiting with the army for the Crusaders to advance, right? And Saladin army was massive. We have no idea. I mean, the sources as always are always very exaggerated in one way or another. Modern estimates, acceptable estimates, towards the oriented towards the largest plausible number, thinks about an army of 45,000, which is really almost a maximum for those times. Logistical capabilities, like more than 50,000 is fiction, and probably was less than 45,000 as a matter of fact. There is also the stereotype a little bit that the Crusaders were fighting against hordes, swarms of Muslims coming from all sides. As a matter of fact, even in this regard, was usually a low asymmetry, but it is effectively true that Crusader armies were, for some political and social reasons, producing kind of more quality troops on average, but compared to the Muslim, that counted perhaps more in numbers, but it was, in the field, that's what doesn't make a difference, because the two things compensated each other pretty well. And of this 45,000, we think of, it's plausible, of a 12,000 professional cavalry, right? It's fairly arbitrary, but that's plausible composition. So the bulk of these armies' force lays definitely in cavalry. This is true for the Muslims as much for the Crusaders. And the Muslims, as you know, are more famous for this combined arms with essentially heavy shock cavalry and horse archery, right? That the Crusaders at some point basically, I mean, they already had heavy cavalry on their own, and they also adapted in many ways with the Turcopoles, these horse archers, mixed origin, right, that served in Crusader armies. But the idea is that the Crusaders were more instead of heavy cavalry plus infantry, right? So infantry is from this sort of middle classes reflecting the ones of the European background, but effectively existing also in the Arab world, and crossbowmen, right? So having this missile power, especially dismounted. It's a bit of a cliche, but in general can serve as a distinction. And tactics would naturally revolve for this continuous harassment from the Muslim side against the more bulky and relatively less maneuverable Christian arrays that were not much less maneuverable because we think, I don't know, that Crusader cavalry was slower. That's a myth. I made an entire video about that, the idea. I don't remember the title, but once again, if you search in Crusader playlist, you can find that. Christian cavalry was perfectly fine. There is no actual proof, even that this prejudice that the Crusaders had worse mounts than the Eastern breeds. There is no concrete evidence to stress that. It may be true to a margin, but to an extent, but it was not definitely a big deal of a determining factor. But it was mostly coordination with infantry that we'll see here was very important. That's also because here we will see effectively a whole Christian army, right, of the kingdom of Jerusalem to march essentially in what looks more like an ambush, right, and having to march in column, protecting cavalry with infantry through all the way through this thing, and effectively also needing to redeploy and to counter-strike, because the usual Saracen tactic had always been naturally to hit the distance, right, and to wear out these heavier troops, to exhaust them, and effectively after that overwhelming them with numbers and when they were tired, which is effectively what happened at Hattin if you look at it. But the difficulties to cope, especially against Western heavy shock cavalry, was really never surpassed, right? This is this utter defeatistic idea that we have matured. I don't know whether it's because of the Vietnam War or something, that Westerners are not good at fighting guerrilla or countering it. The ambushes is something that puts them in crisis. Really, no. There is a pretty transversal, symmetric reality all over military history that tells you that that's quite not the case. And actually, the greatest problem of Saracens was stopping these shock charges that effectively worked. We have to acknowledge that Western heavy cavalry was for real. I didn't notice things up to relatively a few times ago myself, but I had to realize, looking at these battles, that it is true. The Muslims didn't have much resistance, physical stopping resistance to oppose to a Frankish cavalry charge most of the times, and they had basically to perform other tactics, which were sometimes equally effective, like, I don't know, opening the rank or retreating and luring the enemy somewhere else, making them fall in ambushes with flank attacks and so on, which is an experience probably told something also to the Westerners themselves. But that even in there is not a prerogative of one side or the other, as it's been mechanicistically believed, right? The situation is pretty fluid, and probably also these armies were, as we were saying at the beginning, were much more alike than we often realize. So there was this struggle that was going on between the essentially the king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, and the Count of Tripolis, Raymond III. Now, Raymond III, as we were saying before, had led the, and what we didn't say before, actually, before the Battle of Cresson, had led effectively the Saracen detachment that would defeat the Crusaders at the battle, passed through his land, right? And this was normal if you look at Crusader politics at the time, in the sense that, you know, it's not because you're a Crusader you shouldn't let Muslim pass, right? Politics is so overwhelmingly and notoriously complicated that this dichotomies have practically no utility at all. And it was probably a very wise move to do. Contemporary historiography shows us the stereotype that Raymond, being the cleverest of the Crusader leaders, like the one was more understanding of politics, with, you know, in relation with the Muslims, that had a greater intelligence, and stereotyping instead a bit Guy of Lusignan as a sort of, if not an inept, at least as a hasty and, you know, hot-tempered ruler that threw himself into the ambush and didn't want to listen to him. The historical reality, as always, is much more concrete. There were fairly good legitimate reason to go into the, you know, to enter the strategic theater that even Saladin had set up, right, as such. And the fact that this was a defeat in the end is tied to other decisions that went along the way, and in itself characterizing this in figures as simply as 12th century historiography or even later historiography pretends to do. It's not very fair. But we can definitely see that everybody was fundamentally competent in their own way, right? And there were surely people who understood much more about those worlds than we can ever possibly even dream to do. And therefore we ought better to listen to them. So Raymond had been accused of basically of treason for having made the Saracen detachment passing through his lands, and had quarreled eventually with the king. So now when the Crusader army was mastered, there was this, in the face of the major invasion that now instead Saladin started, right, which, you know, the detachment that fought at Cresson was just, you know, a small part, was just an appetizer, and the Crusader leaders had to, you know, to stay together in this united, and that's where in fact the Count Raymond even, you know, made his publicly his homage to Guy as king, and the Battle of Cresson had been, you know, it's considered somewhat a minor encounter, but it was objectively important because the Crusader losses might have included up to 130 knights, right? And that was a very important asset for the Crusader states that were regularly short of probably of fighting men, right? The myth that these lands were somewhat poor, or, you know, that the Crusaders didn't know how to rule them is, I think, is a misassessment, actually. Especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem has a massive, and I want to stress, a massive strategic potential that, yes, it was not exploited, but that objectively could have led the Outremer history some other directions. No, the Crusades were not doomed since the beginning. And we can think that also the Saladin preparatory operations, for example, the ravaging in the Transjordan, had also partially weakened its potential, its momentum, right? And this was a very serious situation anyhow, as King Guy of Lusignan sent out the arrière-ban at the end of May, right? That is summoning all able-bodied free Christian men, so it's the levy of the kingdom. Gérard de Ridefort was the master of the Templars, who was a, you know, close advisor of Guy, and had also this resentment towards Raymond of Tripolis because of the losses of the Templars also suffered during the Battle of Cresson. Was recruiting mercenaries with the money that had arrived from the King of England, Henry II, that was, you know, interested in the thing. Eventually, as you know, Richard Lionheart would join in the Third Crusade. The Crusader effort And these mercenaries were mostly probably mounted sergeants, so at this time still something slightly less probably than the typical miles, as the fully, the most fully equipped and professional knight, but still, an important, I can say average medium cavalry force that now displayed in fact the arms of the King of England because of recognition given to the founding, and the Crusader Army mustered at the springs just south of the castle of Safaria, right? And here in the major map, here in black and white, it's here Safaria, you see in the left side, left border, and so you see here already the place of encampment close at the springs that are dramatically important because of the beverages, and you can make a simple calculation how much horses and men just need to drink, not even for hygienic purposes, and you realize that if you don't have this base, this access to water, you basically can't even wage a campaign in the first place. So by the end of June, the Crusader Army totaled, also here it's just an estimate, but we can think 1,200 knights, right? So this is heavily armored cavalry, and possibly as much as 4,000 lighter cavalry made up of sergeants and Turcopoles, right? So it's an interesting segmentation because it's heavily armored cavalrymen, somewhat medium armored cavalry, and horse archers, respect. So it's possible to think of a 15,000 to 18,000 infantry, right? That is very important. Like the 12th century is still not the full acme of feudal cavalry yet, and especially in the Crusader states, it seems that infantry had somewhat a greater value and had a very important interaction with cavalry, that these two arms had necessarily to cooperate, and everything was naturally based on combined tactics. Infantry literally sheltering heavy cavalry after a charge in another, and essentially forming this spear shield defense from light Saracen cavalry that would harass at very close distance, and responding with crossbow fire fundamentally to our Islamic archery. And infantry definitely on average was nothing, was nothing elite like the elite, but its value was mixed. Let's say it could range from professionals, especially among crossbowmen, to inexperienced local militias, right? And this means in this vision that definitely sources both from Christian and Islamic side stress the fact that the Saracens' army was larger, right? So Saladin enjoyed numerical advantage, possibly of 3 to 2, right? Even though, as we have seen before, it's possible that on average Muslims were less armored, right? Especially in cavalry, right? But that's once again because they had more horse archers probably than the Christians, and that fitted their combined tactics, as we have seen. Christian leaders included the masters of the temple and the hospital and Count of Tripoli. Renard de Chatillon would have started the mass in a way. There's another very fascinating figure with a great strategic talent. If you look at his amphibious operations along the Egyptian coast in the Red Sea, from his fief in the Sinai, the Balian of Ibelin was considered, he was a vassal of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He was considered like a bit of a someone that everybody would listen that. It was a person that would also, in fact, manage to escape battle, lead the resistance to Jerusalem. Reginald of Sidon, Walter Garnier, and the Lord of Caesarea. And so during Saladin's review of his army, the basic array had been agreed. So armies at this time essentially were divided into multiple divisions, usually 3, right, that granted, this fundamentally this balance between compact of concentration of mass, let's say, and also flexibility and gradual effort with the use of reserves. But these also often, like in this battle, constituted somewhat the entire battle line, right? Sometimes with the center and the two wings, etc. Now, Saladin's nephew, Taqi al-Din, was a very talented military leader, would also at some point, be unfaithful to his uncle, but he was really a great commander. Saladin himself, entrusted him, in fact, the command of the right division, right? Gökberi, that was, in fact, the Blue Wolf, was a Turkic commander, also very competent and prudent, commanded the left, right? Say Taqi al-Din was the boldest, and Gökberi the most prudent, and this was very important because Taqi al-Din was entrusted with the most active and aggressive role, while Gökberi did more like the containing one. And albeit we know less about what his actual performance was, but he was a competent commander. Saladin would hold the center, so also the major division of the Saracen army. This included also the van and rear guards, also all the logistical, department that was so important and fundamental to prepare, especially during the night between the 3rd and 4th of July. All the, keeping the supplies ready and bringing water, right? Because this is also this myth that, that the Muslims were more capable of fighting in the desert for some reason, right? This is not really true. I mean, of course, they were more used to they knew the terrain better in certain situations, but they were suffering as much as the Crusaders of the same logistical problems in many ways, but simply they had a very sound organization in this battle. But this is due to Saladin's organizational talent, logistical talent, and strategical as well as tactical vision. And there's not an intrinsic advantage given to Muslim armies in this regard. And so on June the 26th, the Muslims set out on the first stage of their march and made camp at the Kisfin on the Golan Heights. And the following day, the Saracens went down the southern tip of the heights to encamp at Al-Kawani. That is a marshy area between the Lake of Tiberias and the rivers Jordan and Yarmouk. And small parties now were sent across the Jordan to ravage a wide area that here in the map you see in the southern sector between Nazareth, Tiberias, and Mount Tabor, right? So this was the invasion of the main force of Saladin that had started. So the Crusaders were holding, the council of the various commanders in Acre, and they also, however, moved to Safaria to acquire, more precise information. And we don't know when Saladin's army crossed the river Jordan. So entering now what you see here in the map and from the southeastern corner. But it's possible that it was on June the 30th, right? And Tiberias at this point was blockaded, while certain scouts were sent actually as far as Safaria itself, right? You think all these campaigns, it's not that if you don't see an enemy, from the army, you can't see. You think all these patrols going back and forth, engaging also against one of the enemies. So it's a very important reconnaissance phase that eventually leads the campaign and the knowledge and information of the terrain and so on. It's at this point that Saladin, while Tiberias is under siege, moves with the bulk of his force, so the defective army, up to what we see here in the center of the map as Kafr Sabt, right? And here there were several springs midway between Tiberias and the enemy's main position, so it was also a good place to encamp. There's this, it's like a plateau, fundamentally. You can also have a good view from the hills at the end of it, of the way from which, in fact, the Crusader army would approach. On July the 1st, Saladin himself pushed as far as Sefaria, hoping to lure King Guy out, right? Because the whole thing was attracting the enemy out, given the threat posed to Tiberius, but doing it quickly, right? The same day, the Sultan made a reconnaissance in Lubiya that you see here, that would become actually the encampment on July the 3rd, when and the day, in fact, before the battle. That is placed on the watershed. Here you see all the dots that represent the main watershed, so it dominates basically the way the enemies is coming from, and that is on an alternative route between Sefaria and Tiberias, right? So here the deal was actually waiting for the Crusaders, putting themselves in a position where they would effectively prevent them to reach Tiberias, so obliging them to meet them in an open clash. So on July the 2nd, Saladin attacked Tiberias with part of his army, right? And this committed important siege resources like engineers and all their cumbersome equipment, right? And this was the increased pressure on the city, while Saladin himself actually remained with most of the cavalry at Kafr Sabd, so that it was just a detachment to pressure Tiberias that had actually a small garrison, and the town fell, but it was by nightfall. But as it was kind of the normality at the time, the citadel would held, right? The defenders included actually the Raymond of Tripoli's wife, the Countess Eshiva, who in fact led this resistance from the citadel, where she continued to defy the Sultan's army with the troops that had remained. But that's a desperate situation. That's where you can't basically hold the town anymore, but you just exist in these rocks that are studied just to also to exist for a very long time. They're usually in an impregnable position, and medieval warfare has this natural and existential problem for resolving siege warfare, because fortifications are really effective in this regard. The Crusaders were still discussing on Sefaria and what to do, and the same Raymond, whose wife, as we have seen, was in Tiberias, actually argued against marching to raise the siege there, because he stated that it was exactly what Saladin wanted, right? If they stayed put instead, Saladin would have had either to retreat or to attack the Christian army in a strong position. So that would have been an advantageous strategic and tactical option. And especially the main threat was represented by the way that lay in between Sefaria and Tiberias, which basically in this high summer would have caused an acute thirst to the army along the road, since basically along the way there wasn't much of fodder for the horses that were the most important part of the army, also the most logistical demanding, and the one that represented, in fact, the bulk of Crusader forces as such. As I was saying before, these are not very long distances. You can't see from the map, but in that specific, those specific conditions, objectively, that's a tough enterprise to do, and you may never know what happens along the way, because the enemy is there. You know it is waiting for you, so has been preparing, and is just demanding for you to go. So in these councils, Raymond was accused of treachery, as we've seen before, because of his previous alliance with Saladin, right? And Gerard de Riedfort also accused him of cowardice because of what had happened at Cresson, etc. Yet, the council, saw the reasons of Raymond, and yet at the end, between July the 2nd and the 3rd, Gerard de Rudefort continued to, to insist on his line, to attack, and especially try and convince King Guy of Lusignan of his political and military arguments, and that especially, I think they were counting on the fact they had been paid, subsidized by England, that wanted, had and that this force that had been mastered now didn't have to go wasted, right, given the chance of it, because these were massive armies for the time standards. I mean, here, in fact, almost the whole potential of both, dominions had been committed, right? So there are many occasions in which, big armies are summoned, and they even start campaign, but eventually they don't come to a decisive clash. So, but it's natural that there is a great cost behind that as well. I mean, keeping all these troops there costs a lot, right? It's not just strictly economical, logistical cost. It's also, you have to pay these people. You have to give them a reason to stay out, away from their life, from their families, from their work. So this has also great political costs. So in the end, King Guy decided to march out, to set forth, and the Christian army began his travel before sunrise of July the 3rd, and in the direction of Tiberias. And there were, some options, right, on how to reach there, because the terrain is fairly complicated, right? They could essentially go towards this Kafra Khana, as at the time it was known as Casal Robert, then northeast to join the main road to Tiberias near Turan, Turan had a small spring, by the way, and then by there marching north, and then east. And a few kilometers east of Turan, the road split, right? And as you can see here in the map, so the main branch continued towards Kafr Sabt, right, where Saladin's army was deployed, while another that was kind of more difficult, but somewhat, not sure whether shorter necessarily, but it was still an viable alternative, passed through this northerly sweep through Lubia and the horns of Hattin, right? And about 2 kilometers from Tiberias, both the roads plunged down steep slopes to the lake, so that it also was not necessarily smooth, but once you crossed basically the main watersheds, you were arrived. The distances weren't that difficult. And in the second option, there was this steep slope to Hattin with its abandoned spring, right, that eventually could be a viable stopping point for the army for the problem of water. So King Guy actually chose the first road. They marched basically already, of course, in combat acid, let's say, with 3 divisions themselves, with Count Raymond commanding the vanguard, King Guy the center, where the Christendom's greatest relic, the Holy Cross, right, on which Christ was believed to have been crucified, was guarded by the bishops of Acre and Lid, and the rear guard, the 3rd division, was instead commanded by Balian of Ibelin, and that's also where all the Templars were stationed. So these were the picked troops as well. The rear guard, especially, that in these contexts where you fear to fall in an ambush, must be made up of the finest. And this is very important for even filling certain gaps that perhaps that deform actually in the narration of battle. So each of these divisions was similarly composed with their share of cavalry and infantry, right? And the column proceeded with the cavalry actually sheltered by the infantry, right? That was very important because horses at this time were largely unarmored, and the Saracens' horse archers would easily, hit the horse as such. So they needed this infantry shield around them, and also keeping the enemy horses away with crossbows, right? And this situation was not the best one for the Christian morale, especially that there were, certain omens, certain situations that didn't, according to resources, make the journey so pleasant, right? And the horses were said to have refused to drink before setting out, right? And this was a highly superstitious time, right? And they were also cursed by certain people along the way. So these were bad omen in a certain sense. And Saladin, in the meanwhile, outside of Tiberias, had heard that the enemy was on the march, and therefore he went back immediately to Kafr Sabt, where the main army was, and he immediately sent detachments to harass the Christian army, right? That was very important for the Saracen strategy and tactics, right, to wearing out the enemy in this way, so not giving them a rest, right? The problem with this continuous harassment is not actually the material damage that you achieve, but this continuous psychological pressure that doesn't make you realize what the hell is going on, right? Is this attack just a skirmish from a solitary detachment, or is it the vanguard of the main army, right? You have always to stay alert, and you're tense, and your body consumes energies and kind of consumes itself in many ways because of the anxiety. Think of the adrenaline and the physical sufferance of the march, right? These things were extenuating, especially in full summer, right? In those conditions with 42 average, degrees on average as the highest temperature daily. And the march continued, right? And it's possible that the Christian army reached Turan from Safaria at about in the morning, right, the full morning. And at this point, some troops of the Crusader force, especially on the left flank, might have drunk at Turan Spring, that, as we've seen, is present there. But actually, the entire army went on. So basically, they didn't stop to drink further, and this eroded the Christian morale. And also, as they were approaching through this valley you see here, to run towards the Saracens, naturally the enemy pressure intensified, right? As they were moving close to Saladin's camp at Kafr Sabt, and that's where naturally things were getting tougher. So imagine here we're talking about such an amount of troops. Let's say 20,000 people now are stretched also in a column of 2 kilometers in length. Think about the masses here, of the troops, the baggages, the heat, the thirst, the dust, right, and all what the Muslims were actively doing, right, to make this the worst experience possible, right. They were playing drums, so creating this intrinsic tension, right, at a distance. Think about so many troops doing it at once, and in fact, all this dust also impeding the view, and this hail of arrows pouring constantly. So it's a terrible experience, And naturally, the Saracens were coming as close as launching direct attacks, right, with their combined tactics, archery, at close distance, then retreat, and over again, and every once in a while a charge of heavy cavalry. It's a very tough situation. So think about what this means in a column that is technically marching, and how this affects the cohesion of the same column, right? When you're attacked, you have to stop, you have to to withstand the enemy onslaught, and then you have to put yourself in order in the march, and the column gets all segmented and disordered, and think about all the problems of communications in here, like all these messengers going back and forth to know what the hell is going on, because the enemy may have attacked en masse in a certain moment, so everybody was very, very alert. And towards noon, there were especially repeated attacks that slowed the Christian pace, and the vanguard of the army under Raymond of Tripolis reached this town you can see here. That is Mascana. It is at the base of this plateau that rises towards eventually, the horns of Hattin. So this is basically the end of the valley, where as we'll see now, the Muslim army had deployed, right, as a perimeter to effectively encircle the Crusaders. And at this point also Raymond received news that the rear guard had been forced to halt. So at that point, as we'll see now, especially the 3rd Saracen division was probably entered in action. So this was very dangerous, because it means that the rear guard was being cut off, not just by the rest of the army, but especially the retreat route for the army itself, right? So this was a very, very dangerous situation, because the Crusader armies were realizing that if they wanted to get out of there, even if they wanted to come back, they would have had to fight through it. And think about this psychologically speaking. We have seen it similarly in the video on the Battle of Manzikert. I mean, what it means, where that was a much longer march during the day, but the climate was better. This was possibly much worse by certain standards, but the fact of physically having to march with all of your gear throughout you're on fire because of the terrible heat and thirst and all this tension and fear, right? And you feel even more the physical effort to having gone from one place to another. So the temptation is always like, how much is there still ahead? And these guys could see, by the way, that there was the plateau in front of them that was rising. So I think at this point you're already basically exhausted, and you have even to start something more exhausting. I mean, it's really terrible from a psychological point of view in so many ways, and the enemy's all around, right, harassing you continuously. So at this point, I mean, the point of this march, I don't know if we stressed this enough, was to reach effectively now the Tiberias, right? And the idea was to stop at one point at Hattin, in a way or another. So the point is the next water stop was at Hattin itself, which they counted to be accomplished in one day, and we're realizing now at noon, so also the moment of greatest heat, and the hottest hours of the day, that they were already exhausted. So the problem was now they couldn't go back. Apparently, at least they should have committed to a larger engagement, and they were already exhausted. And so the other alternative was now to stop, right? Because the army was already exhausted, disorderly. They were losing communication with the various divisions. The column probably had outstretched itself too much. So the decision was taken essentially to set camp in Mascana and to reach at that point Tiberias the day after. So the Saracens instead, from the other side now, were harassing, that were doing exactly what they had planned to do, and they were harassing the Crusaders to actually prevent them to reach Tiberias, but especially not to reach Hattin. It was closer, right, where there was enough water. It was a big deal, because not only you're exhausted, I mean, of course, the Crusader army had water with them, but it was naturally a few, right? And the situation was pretty damn difficult. Consider that the springs of Hattin are 6 kilometers away from Mascana, so it's not an enormous distance, right? But in that situation, also rising, I mean, with the heat and the altitude rising, marching along this way, the things get much more complicated, especially when you're under archer fire, right? So the army now was, they simply decided that they realized probably that there was no many other option to do, and the space was also not, because there were all wooded slopes around, like there was not many other place to encamp. There is the village of Nimrin that, however, is up the hills, and as we will see now, would be soon seized by the, or at least there were the Saracens in the middle, and it was a problem to reach. Also, Lubia stood on other wooded hills, as you see here in the map. This part is on the plateau in itself. So Mascana was the better option, because it was just the foot of the plateau, didn't require, it was just in front of them, right? So that was a good option. And the interesting thing is that the horns of Hattin were visible in there, but also the lake Tiberias itself. So imagining here to see at not such a huge distance, such a huge amount of water, where water is all what you desperately need, right? So this caused, psychologically speaking, all more discontent, because they said, come on, there's so much water there, let's push forward. I mean, the cohesion of the army was being shattered in part. And Saladin, at this point, sent basically his, let's say, right division, the one commanded by his nephew Taqi al-Din, to block the Christian way to Hattin, right? So this is very interesting, because basically there is a sort of encircling maneuver on the right, that puts the Taqi al-Din's division between Count Raymond's division and Hattin, right? So there is no way the Crusaders now can push forward without engaging with the enemy force, right? And Raymond at this point tried to counter this maneuver, possibly, and we don't know much about how Taqi al-Din effectively managed to outmarch the Christians in a certain sense, but I think there is a fairly, I mean, it's fairly easy to do after all, right? There's not a great distance. It's along the plateau. You don't have to make a lot of ups and downs. You just stop there, and that's also dramatic, because naturally, as we were saying now, the Muslims are on the slope, so the Crusaders are down, so they have also the disadvantage of altitude, and even archery gets sensibly improved by that. So an attack on those positions would have been really very, very difficult, right? But the next day we'll see that it would happen, as a matter of fact, and the Crusaders would be even successful in doing it. So probably Taqi al-Din was deployed on the small hillock northeast of Lubia, blocking the main road to Tiberias. Right, it was the one that here you see in dark black. Right, before I said that the Crusaders wanted to reach Hattin, but that was just the because they knew there was water in there. But the original plan was to go through all the way here. You see the road in the north straight to Tiberias. That's it, without any other movements. But technically, as we will see, in fact, in the next day, it was possible also to reach Hattin and go to Tiberias. Naturally, this is a very, very difficult situation, right? And it's possible that Saladin, consider that the enemy, I mean the Christian army is still intact, so theoretically they can't try to push forward, to break through, right? So Saladin at this point probably tried to enclose further the road to Tiberias, I mean to obstruct it, but shifting his army further on the right, and it's practically certain that his center encamped in Lubia itself, right? So just next to the road to Tiberias, right? There are not many other places where you can do that. Kafr Sabt now is still a logistical base, but the bulk, I mean the whole Saracen army has shifted dramatically close to the plateau, the valley. Towards Nimrin here. You see Maskana, Lubia, and is just very, very close contact with the Crusader army. So, for what concerns the 3rd Saracen division led by Gökböri, we don't know where it was. Like, it was on the left wing. So it's possibly here we have no precise information from sources where it was, but as we were saying before, it was probably cutting off the Christian retreat here between Maskana and Turan, right? If you look at many maps that circulate on the internet, you look at how this battle is often interpreted. It's as if the Saracen army was deployed in a circle all over the plateau, right? But as a matter of fact, in the east, imagine a cap in here in the east, displayed horizontally, and the enemy, and the Christian army trying to push into that. But if you look at this, would entail basically to cut off part of the logistical lines with Kafr Sabt and also the same Tiberias Lake, right? So if you consider this cap, the Saracen light flank would have to be between Nimrin and Maskana, right? And from there, where do they get water, for example? How did they connect in case they have to retreat? Where do they go, right? So actually the most reasonable idea is that here the right, the Saracen right was here between Nimrin and the road towards Tiberias, that Saladin's center was encamped in Lubia, and that Gökböri actually was deployed somewhere here on the left in the valley, or at the foothills of, not from the Sam Turan, because those are very steep areas, but here in the south, and ready eventually to basically cutting off effectively the logistical lines and the retreat route to the Christian army. So to bottle them and to make sure they basically cannot get out there. That's a very advantageous situation. As we will see now, however, there were probably some kind of throwaway Muslim infantry that was deployed actually on the hills between, here you see Maskana and Turan, or let's say between Nimrin and Maskana, let's say better, that but also a bit more westwards, that helped to light up the bush wood to create this smoke, this hot smoke that would eventually in fact choke the same Christian army, from which it would suffer terribly, right? But those are just scattered troops, but main bulks, main divisions were probably deployed in the way we have tried. And it was not like the best option, in the sense that the connection between especially Saladin and the Taqi al-Din wasn't probably, it was its joint was a weak point. And as we will see the day after, probably that's where the Christians managed at one basically to break through, in part, and even managing to escape from there, going towards Hattin, right? But it was a very advantageous position, nevertheless. So much, in fact, that this is where allegedly Raymond de Montfort cried, "The war is over, we're dead, man, the kingdom is finished," because he realized that the Saracens had effectively encircled them, and he was the guy that also in the vanguard had basically the better understanding of what was going on around. Actually, maybe this phrase was pronounced maybe the next day. We don't know. I haven't understood it fully, but I mean, this is valid for the entire situation as a whole. And that's objectively what would happen, or at least they wouldn't die all, he would survive, but and many others, because it is true the Crusaders eventually suffered a lot of losses, both in dead and prisoners, but there were also a lot of them that actually managed to escape, right? It's just that, you know, the bulk of the army got wiped out. That's why, in fact, where Raymond was advised, Raymond advised Guy de Lusignan, the king, to actually to encamp in Mascana, right? Because others actually wanted to attack Saracens' main division, so to start battle in the same day. Instead, at least Raymond was fair about the fact, probably, albeit thirsty, that there was still some water left and that it would have been better to rest for that day and not to engage battle. And that's in fact where the king took Raymond's advice at this point, hoping that at that point it was actually being realized that rather than reaching Tiberias the next day, they would have had to reach Hattin, because now the main problem was literally water, right? It wasn't much and how much it would take to reach Tiberias. Now the situation was literally an emergential one, and the most important thing was reach water, right? Maintaining proper formation the next morning, because at that point it was compromised. So just think about the difficulty of, coordinating an army of 20,000 men in those conditions. Now it's very tough. That's why it was wise, very likely, to stop and to reform, to rest, and to try the push the next day. And in fact, also the way I think I have also a bit interpreted this battle is that, according to me, yeah, the situation was desperate, morale was not great, but I still think that Crusader commanders realized that it was possible to break through the Saracen lines, right? It was feasible to even win the battle at one point. But now the situation was rather more on how that was possible in function of reaching Hattin, right, and water in that regard. And in all this until nightfall, so up to the other half of the day, the Saracens kept harassing the Christian army, right, in camping. So in those wooded areas around Mascana that we were saying before, there were some troops probably at this point that Saladin sent to prepare essentially the dreaded smoke, right? And the situation here at night was also pretty troubled, as we've seen. Taqi al-Din was deployed on the plateau east of Mascana. Saladin in Lubia. We don't know about Gökböris, but we know in general that the Christian and Muslim armies were so close during the night that the pickets could even speak to each other on the distance. So in all this, just think of spending the night as a crusader in the camp. That not only you're thirsty and demoralized because the situation is turning pretty damn badly, right? But even listening in the night, in the darkness, the drums, the prayers and singing of the Muslims, right? Which instead were enjoying far better situation, right? They were actually still in a very risky situation, because we will see the Crusaders were pretty damn dangerous at this point. So it was not over yet. Like, if you interpret this battle as if this was already over because the Crusaders had fallen in a trap, that's not quite the case. Like, there's a dimension here, comparison you have to realize about the moral and physical forces that are still intact largely, in the Christian army, and the next day those would be effectively proven like hell. But the Muslims were definitely enjoying a different situation, because first of all, some troops were taken, they had fully their logistical lines open, right? Probably some troops, I'm not really sure about this, were brought partly back to Kafr Sabt. I don't know if there were some reserves that were refreshing. It's effectively a few kilometers away, so I don't know honestly, but it's possible. But especially now, new supplies were coming, right? The troops were distributed 400 loads of arrows, right? That were very important, because we've seen what for the harassing missile tactics of the Saracen army that would have to wear down with this repeated hail of arrows the enemy morale before then their physical strength, and also there were 70 camels loaded with more bundles of arrows as a reserve were made to be sent in the day after in case of need, right? And while the Christians were thirsty, as we've seen, the Muslims had caravans of camels, a camel carrying goat skins full of water from the lake Tiberias itself, right? This was very, very important. So this naturally shows the advantage of the Saracen army, but also at the same time that the same Saracens needed water. Like, it wasn't going out camping, right? The Muslim army was suffering pretty much as well. It's not that you can harass an enemy army in that way throughout all the day with those temperatures and not being literally exhausted. Like, this is a plot that has been repeated over and over and over again. Like, we concentrate on how tough it was for a Crusader army to be on constant arrow fire under from the side of the Muslims, but think at how exhausting it is for the Muslims themselves to do that. And by the way, not managing naturally to break the enemy apart. It's still there and dangerous. So it's actually a very balanced situation still, right? The odds are still very uncertain for the outcome. So there were also the Muslims used certain reservoirs dug in the camps to be filled with water through these camel caravans, right? So those were pools from which could get water, and even during effectively at a close distance. And Saladin's army had a high morale at this point, because the thing had gone exactly how Saladin had hoped in many ways, and naturally time was playing in his favor, right? Because the more the Christian army was there, the more it was suffering, because they were cut off from water, whereas the Muslims weren't. So every moment was precious for the Christians now. There were also these troops that worked during the night. There were Islamic, the Mutawiyya, right? This rabble, they untrained troops that, however, was sent into the most difficult grounds along the slopes in the wooded terrain to effectively collect brushwood and to collect it and eventually to lighten it the day after to smoke the Christians, and possibly during the night the same brushwood was deployed in certain strategic areas, right? We don't know how effectively the thing worked. We'll see now better. So the night passed, and think about also the tormented night. I mean, we don't have an astonishing information about what was going on, but in the night, it's terribly easy to essentially demolish the enemy army, the enemy morale and strengths, if you basically, I don't know, carry out feint attacks, for example, that you can alarm the enemy with shouts and throwing arrows and making them think it's an attack at night. Well, as a matter it is not. So these guys couldn't maybe even sleep, right? And that's devastating, right? Together with thirst and tiredness and fear. It's really an experience you wouldn't like to have. But anyhow, before dawn of the morning of July the 4th, 1187, the Crusader Army awoke and formed up ready to move, right? So at this point, the array was exactly the same. Raymond of Tripolis commanded the vanguard, right? Accompanied by also Raymond of Antioch with his contingent. Now, you have to give credit to the solidity of the internal command, in the sense that even with all those distrusts and bitter feelings, still, the first, the vanguard position was a position of honor given to Raymond. So Guy of Lusignan recognized the valor of Raymond, and this prestigious position reflects naturally the confidence that the king also had towards him, and the situation was probably not dramatically improved for the Christians anyway, right? Saladin had kept working, made its some of these preparations going on throughout all the night. Yet he didn't actually know yet if the Crusaders the next day would attempt this dash towards Hattin or attack his own position. That was still an enigma, right? And that's, however, the moment in which the Muslims probably set fire to their stacks of brushwood along the way, right? Some think that they were simply lighting up to, in once at once. It's possible that they were actually lighting up along the way. I mean, as the Christian army was passing by, right? It would be even more terrifying, because basically you get the heat, much closer, right? It's not just a matter of getting from far away, but everywhere you go, you have this hot spring that consumes you over and over. Think about all the people now getting completely dehydrated. Completely. Metaphorically so, but at the point you can actually die of intoxication, of exhaustion. These are extremely tough situations. And then, by the way, consider what it means to wear armor at that point. Right, I'm sure many of these people at one point had to even take their armor off, because you literally cook in it, and you can't stand it. Like, say, I don't give a damn, I will be killed by an arrow, but at least I don't die, feeling this terrible sensation the way before. So it's really terrible. We think, generally speaking, that the average equipment in these areas of the world was maybe higher, was maybe lighter, because of this terrible, in certain moments of the year, especially because, like, the temperature was really extreme. So we are on the day of the battle proper, and yet there are many question marks that still leave unresolved. So, as we will see, there is this phase in which, at one point, the Christian infantry is said to have abandoned cavalry because they wanted to run towards Hattin, right? And specifically towards the horns, and remaining there, actually. So, taking this defensive position, hoping to progress further at some point, but also abandoning cavalry. But according to me, it happened all in a fairly logical dynamic, right? And probably the Christian army remained intact, like till the, if not till the very end, but at least the idea is that the before combat began on July the 4th, the army was intact, right? And it kept fighting intact for a long time. At this point, King Gui had been advised actually to act decisively and attack Saladin, right? Main arm. The problem is, we think at this point the army was so exhausted, the morale so low, that the most important thing now was just to try to get out of there if possible, because a major attack on a large scale might have been a disaster, right? Possibly that certain units were already from the early morning not starting to respond because of what they had gone through the day and night before, right? We know that there were actually deserters in the Christian army. There were 6 knights and some sergeants that actually went, past to the Saracen army and told Saladin that actually the Christian army was good as beaten fundamentally. Some of them were Baldwin de Fotina, Raulfus Bructus, and Laudocius de Tabaria. And at this point, it was rather, in fact, Saladin who took action, right? And probably he committed his very center, and his left under Gökberg against the Crusader army. So this is very confused because we don't know exactly how the thing unfolded, but it seems reasonable that at this point the Crusaders are at the foot of the plateau, right? So the more they progress, the more chance there is now that they may break through effectively. So if you engage them while they're still on the plain, and they will not have time eventually, if it's forces, to progress further, even the next day. So the attack is a good decision at this point. The problem is that, as we were saying before, the Christian forces are, however, capable of counter-striking. That's what the Templars did. In the what would be the rear guard, and Raymond of Tripoli vanguard also made a charge now, and that's very interesting, because from one side it shows you that probably the various divisions of the Crusader army, especially the vanguard and rear guard, were dealing now with two different situations of which they probably were not even completely aware, as the column had unfolded, and chaos had ensued, right? With all the smoke and all the confusion, the dust, and so on. So this means that the Christian army was being engaged probably all along the line, right? We don't know particularly. We know much better about the Saracen right than the center and the left. But we can imagine that really the Crusaders now were fencing off the attacks from all three the enemy divisions. The main problem now, and what was more challenged probably in this regard, was Raymond, because he was the path opener of the army, and now he had to attack basically up the slopes against Taqi al-Din division, right? That was blocking the way towards Hattin. So this situation is very, very thought-provoking, because we have actually Ibn Khalid Khan that in his biographies of Gökberg and Taqi al-Din wrote that they both held their ground, although the whole army was routed and driven back. And then that the soldiers, hearing that these two chiefs still resisted the enemy, basically returned to charged, and eventually the Muslims won. So this detail is very fascinating because it shows you that fundamentally the Christians had managed almost to break the Saracen blockade, right? And especially the fact that Gök, Böri, and Taqi al-Din are mentioned here fits pretty well with what we will see now with how things have gone. Because in fact both the Christian vanguard and rearguard made it out of battle, while the center didn't. And the center was also in fact the one engaged by Saladin's center, and instead was the bulk of the Saracen formation in itself. This is interesting because at a parity, of size of the divisions, at least the vanguard and in the vanguards and in the rear guards, we could say like this, so close Christian defeat, or in certain cases actually a victory, as we will see now. And it's difficult to interpret, first of all because we weren't there, but secondly also because the sources are not entirely clear about what happened precisely. And we have also information about one trusted young Amir of Saladin named Manguras in the early stage of the battle. And from the description, from the fact that he had previously served Taqi al-Din as governor in Hama, we think he was probably fighting with him, so in the Saracen right. And we know that Manguras actually charged forward alone. And one source states that he challenged a Christian champion in single combat, and that he was, however, thrown from his horse, dragged into the Christian lines, and beheaded. So, pretty intense fighting here. And there is another source that also states that the same Manguras was actually overwhelmed by numbers, which is, these are compatible statements after all, that match also with the ones that we mentioned now by Kali Khan, right? So the Christian army at this point was almost fully committed in combat, and still it had to push through the blockade. So that's where all the interesting thing comes, because it revolves chiefly around the action of Raymond. And as far as combat of attack as small units concerned, like we can't think naturally that the Muslims were enacting their usual tactics, right? And alternating horse archery with cavalry charges, and Christian infantry resisting and responding with missile fires, and also with cavalry counter charges, even if we don't know exactly how this was performed. Consider that charges were not easily carried out with extreme frequency, especially against enemies that didn't expose themselves. If you look at the battle we made, at the video we made on the Battle of Ramla, that's quite eloquent. There were basically 3 charges throughout all the day, major ones at least. Naturally, individual soldiers like Manguras, individual knights, could go out there and engaging with other small groups. But the idea of the full commitment here is quite important. It's particularly evident even at the Battle of Arsuf, that with Richard Lionheart, that even had to keep his vassals under control, and being clever and having cold steady nerves, let's say, in cold blood, to launch the charge at the same exact moment. Arsuf, in that regard, still proves the fact that these actions were very, very importantly timed, and that it was an order after all. Like, there is the idea that since we see chaos in the sources, the chaos was also in the battle as such. Yes, battles could turn out pretty chaotically, but most over the times, they do still follow a pattern that when it's broken, like in terms of order or cohesion, formation, like the battle is over. So it's the chaos mostly follows the disruption of an army and the retreat, the ensuing retreat. But the rest does follow actually some sort of order, some sort of logic, right? It's not, everything mixed up. No, here the cohesion remains of the various bodies till the end, in spite of all the, naturally, yes, the detriment of the formation, progressive, the erosion of it, and so on. Especially, as we were saying before, the Christians were obliged at one point even to countercharge, but they were being exposed at that point at enemy fire, losing many horses as far as we know. In fact, during combat, it seems not many Christian knights died, because, by those times, armor standards, subjectively, if you didn't get butchered in melee, I mean, traumatized by blunt weapons, etc., killed in those, eye slits or face, opening, I don't know how to call it, but, you could take even loads of arrows without being killed, right? And in fact, it seems that at this point the thing worked pretty well. The point is that the knights got exhausted throughout all this, and the Muslims always naturally trying to avoid direct hand-to-hand combat as much as they could, because they were on average lighter and weaker in hand-to-hand combat, and their strength was especially missile fire at that point, as we've seen with all the loads of arrows had been distributed to them the day before. At this point, in my opinion, the Christian army was still pretty cohesive. Like there were not detachments running away from the battle, from reaching the water. Like most of, at least of the troops remained at their place. Also because there was not much of an alternative. I mean, this idea that especially the infantry left abandoned cavalry at a given moment, when they were still fairly in the open, so at the foothills or on the plateau, is where would they go? I mean, there were Saracens all around, so it's not that there was an opening yet, as we will see now, will be formed. And in fact, this has brought certain, in my opinion, quite imaginative and fantasy explanation, even by some great scholars that dealt with this battle, that had to justify what they found read in one source, not picturing exactly how that answer interpretation would be coherent with their think. Joshua Prower, for example, said that during the night Saladin had basically made all the army turning around for one side, so that would explain how certain troops got to the horns of Hattin, as we will see now. But that doesn't make sense by any military logical standard, right? And there is a much easier explanation at this point, is that effectively that fled of the infantry from cavalry happened at a time in which cavalry had opened a gap into the Saracen lines, and all these troops kind of either followed the same cavalry or part of it, because these were 3 divisions, but we will explain everything now. Or simply they poured out. But think here that troops also have a certain logical behavior in the battle. I mean, the closeness of troops is fundamental. Like, you don't abandon the mass you are in, because that's instinctively something that brings to survival. Who gets isolated out there gets butchered down. That's what probably happened even to some who might have simply gone insane at that point, because of the thirst and the heat, and because the throat was completely dry now, and ran out and got butchered. Hysterical, nervous breakdowns. I mean, you can't find in these situations all the time, right? And that's the moment in which you really lose any discipline. You go out there to die, right? But probably the army maintained its cohesion fairly more than it's usually being believed. The idea here is that, as we were seeing before, Taqi al-Din division was the main problem. That was like probably the most aggressive division of Saladin army. It was also normal in Saracen's armies over the times, where the right division, the right wing, would be the more aggressive, and the left one the most receptive, the more defensive. Let's put it in this way. Also, we'll see eventually also what probably happened in the rear guard. But the most important thing here is that Count Raymond now probably managed at this stage to break, or at least to make retreat or move Taqi al-Din's division. Right? We've seen in the sources before that there is evidence of very hardly fought battles in which probably great part of this Saracen divisions had been routed by the same Christians, and that only maybe the bodyguards of Taqi al-Din or Gökberi remained to fight, and around them eventually the rest of the troops would regather at some point. But there is information, there is evidence that effectively Raymond of Tripolis charged Taqi al-Din so much that he managed to break through his lines, to open this massive gap. It was very, very risky for the Saracen army. It was basically divided Taqi al-Din's division from Salah al-Din's. That's very, very important. So here you would have a heavily armored cavalry charge in the typical Frankish style that manages to break, or at least to distance Taqi al-Din's division. There is even one source, if I'm not wrong, that basically states that the same Saracens couldn't take this charge, so that they basically split into the two wings, like, and then let them pass. It's not clear where it's talking about the actual two divisions of Saladin and Taqi al-Din, or if actually the same Taqi al-Din's division kind of opened at some point, which, this tactics of opening, also leaving a retreating, especially the heavy cavalry, and letting the enemy passing through while the wings target the enemy cavalry from the flanks, it were known at the time, right? So it's possible. But here it seems rather to me that Raymond literally broke through the enemy division, which is a massive, and it broke through in the sense that eventually managed to escape the battle through that, right? And opening this gap from the plateau towards the horns of Hattin, and Hattin itself. In fact, Hattin, right, was reached by Raymond, but eventually didn't go to Tiberias, where his wife was, in the citadel, because he rightfully deemed to be more prudent to go north and to retreat to Tyre, and that's how he escaped the battle. So if you look at that in perspective, it's that basically the vanguard broke through the enemy lines and made it out of the battle. How that situation was basically the most reasonable. In that situation, that was the most reasonable thing to do. And this caused a pretty serious situation for the Saracens that now had an entire gap in their formation. They had to close in a way, right? And probably at that point, many Christians actually poured through the gap, regardless of order. That's probably when the thing of the infantry that detached itself from the cavalry happened. Because probably it was the cavalry that was entrusted with the counter, attacks at that point, because the infantry was, we don't know, probably some infantry remained actually even to withstand the assault, but we have at least this information that the infantry reached en masse the horns of Hattin, and didn't want to come down to help the cavalry. So this was a very bad situation, and some say that this charge was ordered by the king himself, which is possible, telling the truth, because we have no reason that, at least at the beginning, I mean, communications had necessarily jumped, but I like to see it that maybe that charge was unavoidable. And especially that it was that charge that opened the gap itself, not that the gap had opened. Right. Also because this was opened chiefly, as we will see now, towards Hattin. That is not towards like Tiberias. And what would this mean? Well, it would mean actually that if you look at the map, the situation when you think at the position, where Taqi al-Din was deployed, was actually like perpendicularly posed to the front of the of Saladin's division at Lubia. And if you look at that axis, it goes straight towards Hattin, not towards the road for Tiberias, right? So if that had been the case, actually, well, maybe if Raymond had gone straight to Tiberias, that would have been a point. Here, he didn't even go there. He just went to Hattin, and if we think that Taqi al-Din division was instead closer to Lubia, where probably there would have been no gap between Saladin's and Taqi al-Din division to exploit, because at that point the road towards Hattin would have been freer, right? So my take on it is actually that you see here where there is a watershed close to Nimrin. Well, that's probably where Taqi al-Din's division was stationed, and Raymond broke it and went straight towards Hattin. This is my interpretation, and I think it's the most logical thing to do. I mean, probably the plan was exactly to break through there, and to eventually, and even from the Saracen side, you see, it was an acceptable risk, because after all, even if the Crusaders had broken Taqi al-Din division, which might have even retreated consciously, probably towards Nimrin, this village over the hills, the Crusaders' right flank would have been constantly exposed to Saladin division by the rear, possibly by Gökberg's, about that we know basically nothing about, that however was probably committed with the Crusader rearguard actually made it out of the battle. So things might have even gone badly for him. In fact, Muslim sources do not talk about him, because possibly they were trying to conceal the fact that if he had had a successful role, we're not talking about him. Okay, we're talking about the 12th century, so we are lucky in the first place to have certain indications about his battle. They don't have to explain everything. But if the rearguard came out of battle and came back the way it came, so towards Acre, Safaria, right? Chances are that it's just hypothesis, but either Gökberg's division was broken as well as those sources before claim, or maybe that part of them just eventually couldn't hold the enemy, and maybe broke or put them aside, and they concentrated eventually, as we will see, to break down the second Christian division, the one with Guy of Lusignan, the bishops, the Holy Cross, etc. Right? But this means practically that just the second division remained stuck in a way, probably on the plateau. So much, in fact, that we know that King Guy ordered his army to halt and put up tents. So we know actually from, as we will see now, how the battle unfolds, that King Guy stopped, right, while Raymond went out, right? It was not a betrayal, right? It was probably something that had needed to be done. But you have to think in this context that the second division here, being exhausted and under pressure from the center of Saladin's army, so the largest one, made a stand, that is the last stand, as we will see, that eventually brought to the defeat. But the interpretation of this battle is very, very seducing, because it shows that it was not the complete defeat. There were certain parts of the army that managed to sneak out, and that's particularly, I mean, it's not a victory, of course, by any standards, but at least not all the entire army got trapped. It was a clamorous Muslim victory, there is no doubt about this anyway, but still, about the tactical development of this battle, you can't say that it wasn't a total encirclement and annihilation of the Christian army in its entirety, right? So yeah, that's the main interpretation I actually give to the army, right? We know that eventually Raymond, in fact, ran down here the slopes towards Hattin. From there went to Tyre, right? And also, while the last stand took place in the most even iconic place here, I put a lot of photos in the video, that is the plateau of Hattin, when you can see pretty well the horns, and where actually also part of the battle took place, and where the infantry is said to have taken position. That is interesting because if infantry could simply run towards Hattin, right, but probably they were closely pursued and pressured by the Saracens so much they couldn't take a better position to defend. In fact, orientatively speaking, we think that the 2nd Christian Division actually made it to the horns, that, as you see here, are at the northern easternmost end of the plateau, right? So Hattin, crosshairs very, very close, right? But you can't throw yourself down the slopes because they're very steep, whereas where Raymond passed just northwest, where it's more gentle and he could reach them, could reach Hattin. So that's a very serious situation for the 2nd Division that almost made it out apparently, but I mean almost in the sense that, you know, had from Mascana had got through most of the way close to Hattin, but didn't make it. So this, in perspective, shows you also the fact that most of the Crusader army actually managed to get through the Saracen blockade during the battle. That it wasn't a situation in which, you know, that they got blocked since the beginning and butchered down. They got to that point, and that's where they got encircled and annihilated, both killed or taken prisoner. And there is this story, in fact, of the problems between the infantry and the cavalry. Like, first of all, cavalry, as you know, by definition, cannot defend. You need to dismount to defend on cavalry. There's no other way to do it. Better it can countercharge. But on the plateau, the situation was getting very, very heated up. Saladin was pressuring pretty damn hard. The attacks were pretty violent. The same Saladin actually encouraged the troops, because seemingly now, not only they didn't want the Christians to escape, but also they needed to win it. Like, this thing was not won, was not over yet. They could lose. Like, if Saladin's division had been broken, actually Hattin would have been a Christian victory. You know, hard fought, closely won, but still there was a chance in the plateau and at the base of the horns, that in which the Christians counterattacked very vigorously, right? We know that, you know, at this point the knights had actually lost most of their horses, but nevertheless, even on foot, they kept on counter-striking. We know that if you look at these photos, even you can see along the horns, aside from the altitude, naturally it makes this a sort of natural fortresses. There are also these stones that works a bit as walls. Those are pretty damn effective against cavalry, right? So there was a situation that is, in fact, handed down to us by the same Islamic historiography, that says that Saladin kept, you know, a pretty concerned eye on what was happening there, because the battle was not evenly solved by having pushed the enemy up to that point. Like, that was a pretty bitterly fought last stand. And we know, though, that there was this problem of the relic of the Holy Cross was big, right? It was, I think, was brought in carriages and things, and it seemingly was this was the banner of the army, actually, and that's where the troops, together with the tents that had been put by Guy of Lusignan, also on the horns. So those function, we know also from the statutes of Templars, as banners, as gathering points. Like, if you don't know where you have to go, you look at banner, you look at that specific point of battle, because the battlefield can get that messed up, and you know when you have to retreat, which in the dust and in the confusion, it's in all the traumatizing things that are happening there. Like, people were ripped off, blood everywhere. I mean, the shouts, sufferings, stink, the heat, thirst. I mean, all the first most horrifying pictures you can imagine are there, right? So this is not just a visual problem. This is actually about the fact that you're freaking out because you're about to be annihilated by people who know that can actually kill you while they take you, as would happen for some knights even. So, and the infantry apparently, at least this is the usual interpretation, is considered the one that took refuge on the horns proper, even if actually, as far as I understood, all the second division took position there, right? But there is this idea that the bishops begged, together with the king, for the infantry to come down to support cavalry, to defend the Holy Cross, right? Because it was the most important relic of Christianity, and they refused, because they said, "We are thirsty, we're dying of thirst, actually. So, and we will not fight," right? So it's as if they were basically surrendering, right? Because Hattin was very close, but it was unreachable from the horns because of the very high steeps and very inclined ones. And the simple thing was, let's surrender. There is no reason to fight, because also the infantry is not this very professional, warlike. These are largely unprofessionals. Cavalrymen live exclusively for war, so their mindset is, we fight to the death. Like, this is you can easily see it at Battle of Cresson. Like, the Templars charging against enemies that were more than 10 times at them, allegedly, and because that's what they were conceived for. Like, in the Templar as a monk and a warrior was conceived exclusively for throwing itself into the fray. Doesn't matter how many the enemies were, and fight to the death. That's the mental horizon of a Templar knight. There is no other possible exception to that. That's what they're conceived for, what they're trained for a lifetime to do. That's what they will do, right? Sometimes, yes, ideally, because not everybody is suicidal for definition, but when there is so much at stake, right, you tend to do things, especially if you're a military professional. Remember that a medieval knight, is one of the peaks of military professionals in the entire history of mankind, right? We're talking about some of the finest men that are cut exclusively for that task, right? They're not good at much else, but specifically at that, and that's what they will do. So, but it's even at the same time, as we were saying before, that cavalry without infantry doesn't work very much. These knights probably had to dismount to defend themselves, and still needing the infantry support, the normal footmen support, and yet there was apparently this, gap between the two things. This is interesting because, of course, footmen kept fighting alongside the knights in some measure, but there was this very pictorial situation has been shown even in some movies, ideally, that the Muslims now began to, after all this wave, after all this passage and this battle that was fought along kilometers, as you understand now, were regrouping, right? The Christian vanguard was out of the battle. this is probably the moment in which the rearguard was going. So this center now was attacked by all the Saracen forces that had remained on the field. So this last stand at the horns, that's where the thing got like, there's no way out of it, apparently, because as we were saying before, also Saladin, we'll see now, was very concerned about the outcome of this battle, because the Crusaders were ferociously fighting, counter-striking at that point. There was the royal tent of Guy de Lusignan. It was bright red and visible to great distance. It was set up, as we've seen, just on the southern horn, in fact, and it was the gathering point. And the Holy Cross, we don't know what it was taken, right? Albeit we know it was actually seized by Taqi al-Din's division that probably now, after having distantiated itself to Nimrin, we think, after the breakthrough of Raymond of Tripolis, now came back to the horns, right, a few kilometers away, and reconnected with his uncle division and possibly other detachments, even from the 3rd Division. I don't know, but it's just an hypothesis. And this is also the moment in which, you know, pretty crude things happened. It said that Taqi al-Din made this first charge just after that Count Raymond had managed to escape, and that's where the Bishop of Acre actually died. Where the bishop was the one who carried the Holy Cross properly, and the Holy Relic was taken by the bishop, however, of Lid before falling into Taqi al-Din's hands, right, as well. Others say that the bishop of Lid took the Holy Cross up on the southern horn, so to where the king was fighting, so that the Holy Cross actually made it to the horns, and that it was captured actually during one of the last charges by Taqi al-Din's troops, right? So we don't know when the Holy Cross fell, but that's probably for a Christian, like the most devastating sight that you could ever even remotely conceive, right? So if there was a moment in which the day was lost, it was definitely when the Holy Cross fell. Doesn't matter how many resources were left there to be spared, but the battle was lost, right? We want to see it ideally like this. So there is this picturesque image of the Crusaders basically surrounded by the Muslims, basically from all sides, aside from maybe the northeastern one where they had the steeper slopes, and this idea of, you know, the Muslims, horse archers, making this sort of Cantabrian circles around them and showering them with arrows, like in the most typical Crusader warfare fashion, like a typical battle. And at this point, however, consider that, as we've seen, the Ayyubids had many arrows in this battle, but that's probably a moment in which you have exhausted a lot of them throughout all the fight, because arrows do cost a lot, and they're not infinite. And this is probably a moment in which it's getting pretty damn tough and rough, and in which the Saracens are actually obliged to come at close quarters and to engage in hand-to-hand combat. And that's where they would suffer ferocious losses as well, because, as we were saying before, those Crusaders there, especially the Knights, were not people who would, you know, surrender easily, and they were perfectly trained and conceived to do that, to get into the midst of the fray, butchering down people as much as they could, and doing it pretty damn well. Because if there was a thing you could do pretty damn well as a medieval knight, is dismembering people to death. Right, that's your first task. You're a butcher first class. That's the job, right? A lot of blood, and pretty damn mind-wrecking in many ways, because these people were trained in that sense since they were children, right? And that's the only thing they had to do. The Muslims weren't any better. I mean, they were pretty damn ferocious, but as we have seen, they also had, this more distance, approach, and more like skirmishing, hitting and running, and they were pretty damn good at that specifically. That's what the Western Knights never quite got, but definitely at this point, when you had to come at close range, the Muslims were disadvantaged on average, and then there were plenty, naturally, of Saracen Knights were pretty damn as good as much as the Christian Knights, exactly in the same way. Like, they were knights and trained to butcher down people as a regular thing. And I want to stress here the blood, because we don't, when we think of this battle, we think sometimes as, I try to stress here the intelligence of the tactical development and how that's objectively the single most important thing. But you can't take this as gallant, plays between, in a chivalric fashion. Here you have to get the people die in the most horrifying, atrocious, painful, and unimaginably horrifying ways. You have to understand the sufferings. If you don't understand what it means to die disquartered, like, I don't even know how to say that, you can't get how ugly and bad and dark this whole thing gets. Because what you would have seen in these places, in a regular battlefield all the time, is something you would have never forgotten till the way you died. And yet this is what these people actually lived for. Like the knights, their life was pretty damn miserable. Like, most of them died of illness, or with rotting limbs in a ditch in their own excrements. Like, dying face to face with the enemy, right, was a honor and a privilege and a dream that every knight would dream to die in. And plus, feel all the religious mystics of this. Like, these guys were fighting to go to heaven. Like, a person who falls in that condition might have surely at some point reason in dualistic terms, in the sense that, okay, yeah, I will go to heaven, but for now, let me enjoy life a little bit more. But falling for Christianity or Islam in this regard is heaven itself, right? And these people are so gloriously proud of doing this. So, and they will put all the best efforts in it. If you don't get this as essentials of medieval warfare, you can't fundamentally understand this whole thing. You can understand how tactics work, whatever, but if you don't get this mindset, you don't get the battle. You don't get the fight. You don't get the moral dimension of this, because this thing is a moral clash. It's not physical. It's primarily moral. The physical comes second, right? And also from the physical point of view, think about the sheer torture that this battlefield was. Sheer torture, in which you have to throw yourself willingly in, because one thing is getting tortured by someone, but one thing is torturing yourself to get into this. And think about, in this sense, how much the moral forces mean. Because if you're not determined to do this for whichever reason it is, you will never do it by any standard, because this is literally hell on earth, in the Holy Land. Hell on earth. So I needed to rant in this regard, because I like so much this side of the story. Like, you can't see this as a gently mechanicistic thing. You look at these videos of reenactors that pretend to explain to you how people fought each other, like by poking sticks and laughing at each other, and tack, like that. These people went on each other, they bited them, they broke their bones, they dismembered, they disemboweled themselves. They ripped the limbs off the hell out of them. How can you think even remotely to reenact what it was like? The physicality of this world, of jumping against a person and smashing it down. How do you do it among friends in 2010? You have literally no idea what real combat could be at this point. It was insane. It was utterly insane. No reenactment of any type has ever even gotten minimally closer to the substance of what this thing actually was. By not even the slightest margin. by not even the slightest margin, because people are dumb and they focus just on the equipment, on the weapon. This is all about moral forces. Moral forces. Fuck weapons. When you want to dismember a person in front of you, weapons have literally no meaning at all. It's how much you want to kill that person that makes the difference. You have to understand this if you want to understand history. The rest is garbage by the uttermost ever, right? So, this is what happens in war. So we know how this thing ended. In the end, imagine attacks down the hill, swarming on all sides, people throwing rocks, helmets, shouting, all the things they can find, attacking even with bare hands, right? This is what you would see. And the way out of there was impossible, as we've seen now, especially when they were surrounded. And there was an attack, a consistent attack, launched, as we've seen, by order of Saladin, performed by Taqi al-Din against the Crusader Knights, specifically. Those were the guys who made their last stand. Those were the beasts. Because those were freaking people you would have not loved to meet face to face in combat. And this happened on the Southern Horn, where we have seen that the king's stand, and in fact the king's retinue was the last to give up, right? And possibly even the Holy Cross was taken, but we're not sure, as we have seen. And Saladin was back in the attack, right? And he was covering the sector himself, and infantry at this point also had to be committed, because, by the way, most of the operations we've seen now, most of the action we've seen now is being led by cavalry, right? All the softening up of the enemy lines with arrows and the various hit and run things, it's mainly cavalry. Infantry from the Muslim side is doing essentially what it's doing from the Crusader side, with the exception in this battle that it's more on the defensive than, I mean, that the Muslim cavalry is on the offensive, and therefore, like, the Muslim infantry is fresher on average. We can't think, maybe not excessively at this point. They had surely participated to combat as well, but on average, they're surely fresher than the Crusader, both cavalry and infantry. And we know that the Christian knights had gathered in this flat space, made at least 2 vigorous countercharges, and this is when Saladin actually freaked out, and he said, "Away with the devil's lie" to the troops, because the Christians at this point were actually still believing to make it through it. Right? This is how closely won actually was for the Saracens. This thing. I mean, till the very end, the Christians had some choice of making it objectively. And in fact, the full commitment of Saladin for center suggests that those were the last resources, right? Those were the last force that was left, and that could make it now, chiefly, I think, with overwhelming numerical strength at that point, to storm the horns from the southwestern foot of them. And as twice counter charges for the Christians, there were twice, 2 charges up the slope from the Muslim cavalry. Now, charging up the slopes, believe me, it's difficult. I mean, it doesn't take me to tell you, but think after a day like that day, what it meant, right? To fight people who are entrenched in their position, who are throwing down the hell on you, and have no chances but making it through, essentially butchering you down in the middle, because that's the only way they can do it. So that's even just great credit to Ayyubid cavalry in that, because it's also very tough ground, tough terrain for cavalry. And at this point, Saladin's son, Afdal, that was next to his father, looked at the Christians and said, and cried out, "We have conquered them." But Saladin, more wisely turned and said, "Be quiet. We shall not have beaten them until the tent falls." And naturally, as this happened, the Muslim sources, I don't know in the Christian ones, but it's obvious that that's the moment wanted by God, of course, in which the Christian tent fell, right? So that was obvious that the example of the intemperate youth that says, "Okay, we've won them," and Saladin, now a full-grown, mature man that has seen it all before and knows about the risks of this, inherent to this, and said, "Wait till that tent falls," right? That's the king's, Guy de Lusignan's tent that falls. That's how it happened. So at that point, it was objectively over. That's the moment in which the Christians, I think, more than giving up, they were literally exhausted. Like maybe their minds answered, but their bodies didn't. They basically threw themselves to the ground. Right? I would like to stress this. Imagine what it means to fight for a day under, 42 degrees, showered constantly by enemy arrows, having to make 2 counter charges under overwhelming superior forces. You're done for, right? It's a miracle that surely most of these people actually had some syncope or something, like they actually collapsed and died because of exhaustion. It's quite easy in those conditions to die like that. Doesn't matter that these were fully kind of young, tough people on average, but has literally nothing to do with that. You die like that as well, right? You simply collapse. That's such a level of exhaustion that you don't make it. And even for the rest of your life, it's quite likely that you will not recover from it. Possibly most would, but that experience would mark you for the rest of your life, even from a physical point of view. You could have consistently felt you were weaker after an experience like that, because what you, in those 2 days, you suffered is something that cannot be the human organism is pretty delicate. Like you can't expose it to such atrocities in a way like this. So as we were saying before, actually a very few well-armored knights had been killed, right? The battle fundamentally ended like this. The Christians simply were overwhelmed, surrendered, captured, killed. We don't know much of what happened to Gökböri division on the Muslim left. The fact that the Christian rearguard, including its leader Balin of Ibelin, escaped near the end of the battle. Seemingly, we don't know what the end here, near the end, actually means, temporally speaking. In my opinion, it's possible that actually the rear guard didn't get very close to the horns at all. Possibly they remained as close to, I don't know, literally we have no idea, but the concept to me is that possibly, they simply were engaged. If they were engaged at the same time of Raymond's vanguard, it's possible that effectively this happened very distant from the horns. Couple of kilometers from them at least. and that they got back, they escaped, in fact, the way that they had come, right? And this would entail the fact that Gökböri division was crushed along the way, and we literally know nothing about it, right? And that's maybe that's why the Muslim chroniclers, they didn't want to show that there was a dark shadow on the victory, in a sense that maybe one part of their army had been defeated, right? So, but we don't know because the sources are too vague in this regard. Like, an absence in this regard doesn't necessarily mean that. But if you follow the structure, I mean the unfolding of the battle, tactically speaking, if those guys came out, chances are that they break through the left Saracen left division, just like probably Raymond of Tripolis did, with Taqi al-Din's one reaching Hattin, right? So what is often misunderstood about this battle is that many Christians got out of it, right? As large as this army was, and as many as effectively the dead and the captured were, still many Christians managed to escape after all. It wasn't a total annihilation, right? And there were captives, and pretty damn first class ones. King Guigui himself, his brother Geoffrey de Lusignan, Geoffroy, you could say better in French, the constable Amalric de Lusignan as well, the Marquis William de Montferrat, Reynald of Châtillon, Alfred de Torrent, the Master of the Templars, the Master of the Hospitaliers, right? That gives you the dimension of the disaster. Like, this losses among the Templars, and these were elite troops that were irreplaceable, right? These weren't troops that you could reconstitute after a while, right? These were all battle-hardened veterans on average, or at least people who had a pretty specific training and discipline, as we've seen before. So that was a very precious asset, was lost in great number. Great minds were lost, great commanders were lost. But as we've seen also among the Templars, it was something that managed to get out there. So we don't know how this happened. Once again, we have no idea what happened on the rear guard actually, right? But a substantial part of them managed to come out there. So the entire leadership of the kingdom of Jerusalem, except for Raymond of Tripolis, Balian of Ibelin, and Joscelin de Courtenay, had fallen into Saladin's hands, right? And this was a staggering victory, right? The Sultan was, ironically merciful. He offered this cup of cold sweetened water to King Guy, right? Sugared water at the time was extra luxury, right? Was typical noble drink, and plus cooled. After having fought under the cooking sun for 2 entire days, you're like a roasted chicken. It's also pretty dangerous even to drink cold water like that. This was offered to King Guy, and there is this myth, this legend, maybe it's true, who knows, that they also depicted in Kingdom of Heaven that Guy feared to be poisoned, and he passed the cup to Reynald of Châtillon, whom Saladin had sworn to kill. And this was, according to the Muslims' way to, or at least to the Arabs, I don't know specifically, but it belonged to this broader, to this chivalric code that Islam had. It was actually strikingly close to the Western one, and part that had also been compenetrated. In Spain, for example, you can hardly tell what was wound, right? But the idea that if I give you to drink, it's not because I want to kill you. And killing a king, by the way, is like very bad. So the distrust, and this fits with the historiographical cliche of Guy of Lusignan being responsible, whatever. And that's why allegedly Saladin said at the site, this criminal, referring to Reynald of Chatillon, was given water without my consent, and as such as my safe conduct does not extend to him. And that's why, you know, at that point Reynald knew that he was done for, so he answered not arrogantly in this typical Frankish fashion, because, you know, the most clear, one of the most clear characters we have from Byzantine Arab sources is that the Franks were literally the best, possibly the best, at least cavalrymen in the world. But if there was something, it was that they didn't know manners. They were, from their perspective at least, they were brutes and constantly, you know, disrespectful, indisciplined. Naturally, that they were biased themselves in saying, you know, in not understanding fully this, but this inherent pride of the Western Knight, right? This special, you know, this contempt towards the enemy. You know, we often hear that, you know, Christians and Muslims, yeah, they kind of you know, respected each other after all. Well, yes, but you know, if you yeah, you respect or disrespect, but even if you respect each other, this doesn't mean you can't massacre each other happily, like it has always happened, even among Muslims, of course, and among saying Christians themselves. I mean, but that's where Reynald of Chatillon was killed. He was beheaded famously, and at least that's how the chroniclers say. And at that point, Saladin placed a finger in his enemy's blood and rubbed it to his face, which was a symbol of a fulfilled vengeance. And there were other prisoners who were killed, actually, and for which we also know how many troops there actually were, in part because the about 260 Templars and Hospitallers taken alive, Bar Hebreus actually mentions only 80 were executed. So there are other sources. We don't know about the losses. Like, some sources say 1,000 knights were killed or captured. So this would mean that this could fit actually with the numbers of the I mean, of the fact that most of the losses had occurred chiefly in the central on the second division, made up chiefly of secular knights, so that maybe the rear guard suffered relatively less losses. But I mean, even 80 men, if they hadn't been 260 or 200, but even 80 men is a lot among Templars and Hospitallers. But yeah, this could even fit with, you know, many others of them escaping, even if their commanders had been captured. Behad-Din claims like 30,000 captured, 30,000 killed, but that's just fairy tale. The Christian army was not even that big in the first place, but secondly, those are not real numbers. But surely they tell how big the losses were in general, because these were high, for sure, right? 1,000 knights taken. Who knows? Right? Possible? Yeah, why not? I mean, it would be like the worst possible scenario in that regard, but it's at least compatible with reality. So there is a lot in this battle that is... By the way, Tiberius fell eventually, and Raymond's wife, Shiva, actually surrendered the citadel, and she was left, you know, going back in Christian lands by Saladin. And the rest of the prisoners actually reached Damascus on July the 6th. the Turcopoles probably were slaughtered all, because these were renegades from the Muslim faith, hence no mercy was shown to them. But it's probable that the Turcopoles actually were a bit more mixed than that. It's simply that they were relatively cheaper troops, so they weren't worth the ransom, and they were simply massacred. And the idea is, we have also this knowledge that the captured Templars and Hospitallers were killed because they were given choice of converting to Islam or execution. And this is actually contrary to Muslim law, right? So this is funny because it's being used also by terrorists. As you know, we had examples in recent years that that's actually against Islamic law. You can't convert someone under the threat of death, right? Because there is a noble way of interpreting the Quran as well that those comebacks do not do. And that's why we wish all terrorists to die in the most horrifying ways and to go straight to hell where they should belong. However, this is how it's explained, the 230 roughly slaughter among the military orders after the battle, which is pretty damn brutal, right? That's what this guy, that shows you, by the way, how they wouldn't crack, right? You can't ask a Templar or an Hospitallers to convert to Islam. Is it a joke, right? Those guys train exactly for the gun, and that shows how, the backbone that these people had at the time. Albeit a few converted, one Templar of Spanish origin that eventually became a commander at the garrison of Damascus is to be found in 1229 as such. And albeit at that time he would have been an old man, right? Other knights and leaders were, however, ransomed, while most of Christian infantry went into slavery, right? And sadly enough for them, also because don't think that the knights actually gave a damn about these people. Let's be totally honest about this. For the medieval knight, who fought like people, infantrymen, right? As such, no noblemen were actually inferior beings. They were not even human beings. So that again, I don't know. Maybe some of them had a better life in slavery. I don't think so, but the mechanism of slavery, especially in the Ayyubid and later Mamluk armies, sometimes was a pretty advantageous thing in some ways, because it was also a mean of career. But I don't think that this was the case. Actually, these were I suspect it was entirely brutal as it can sound. And we think that as many as 3,000 Christians actually managed to flee the Battle of Hattin and took refuge. This is also very important, naturally, in the local, castles and nearby fortified towns. Like when you think of medieval battles and how the enemy, one army broke and fled. Well, their run usually wasn't, unless they were in full enemy territory, very long, because the medieval world was dotted everywhere by fortifications. Like they could be small, but they were still very effective, and therefore the whole thing. This happened actually in Christian territory, and even if the Muslims won, there were still plenty of garrisons around. So this is the dramatic reality of a medieval battle, of one of the most important battles of medieval history, indeed. Possibly the most important battle in the Crusades history, and for the Crusaders evidently also kind of the worst one in many ways. And a great Muslim victory that highlights definitely the great capacities as a politician, as a military man of Saladin. That was a very he was a great man. Yeah, I mean, there is all this kind of positive legend that eventually spread legions in his favor also among the Christian world. Christian chronicles in the Middle Ages go totally crazy for Saladin. They love him. He figures in so many novels and stories as always the proud and noble and gentle and generous, right? These people, naturally, as all great men, were ruthless, capable individuals that naturally made it, in their life on the corpses of thousands and thousands of people that they had slaughtered for their success. And so the morality of this is debatable in the measure in which you realize, however, that those times were effectively like this at every single level, right? It's not that this person was worse than others because had killed more people. This person was a very capable person, was just a person who had been more capable than others in killing consequently more people. But killing people in the politics of the time was the norm. Crusaders killed each other regularly. Muslims killed each other regularly. This is the history of the Crusades in a nutshell, in many ways, and the reality of most of history. Like, this has basically nothing to do with religion as a political dynamic, right? You can be fueled by religion, but as any other motivation. But we all know that in politics you kill other people, because otherwise, what kind of politics is it? I mean, where have you been? And have you ever opened a history book? It's just a continuous bath of blood, nothing else, right? We're lucky that in this period it's just less than the usual, but I mean, it's completely normal. You may not accept it morally. In fact, you don't have to, but it's simply how it is. So those are two different things. And I must say that, of course, the Christians, at the beginning of the video, I tried to, to maybe entice you a little, saying, they didn't make mistakes. They were all competent in general. Evidently, the Crusaders made a mistake here. Pretty big one, but at the same time, as we have seen, the odds were much more balanced than we think. So, even in perspective, this went badly wrong for them, and it was a disaster to say the least. But at the same time, if you look at how the battle occurred, it was actually also a great Muslim victory, in the sense that it was not easy to get in the first place, not even in these conditions, and that also the Muslims probably suffered pretty hard of this battle. So, as you know, this would open to the conquest of Jerusalem, the thing. But so this battle is however very instructive in my opinion, because it shows you, after all, that symmetry we were talking about before, right? That specific idea that you can't judge, of course, war as if you were judging football teams, right? I get an astonishing amount of views. I deal with with history of politics and warfare in the Middle Ages, right? So this is a condemnation to have received masses of waves of people who watch these videos, not because they have any historical understanding or preparation and intelligence, or just because they want to cheer for their football team, like who won here, the guys that they deem to be the good ones or the bad ones, who was the worst, which was the best, which was the evil, which was the good, and this garbage that will lead to mentally underdeveloped people. History is a serious thing, and it's very complicated. When I talk about these battles, normally I don't have the time to study the sources one by one, because as I said often in my videos, I did it once in my master thesis, and it took me 1 year to do for one, right? So these are not things you can prepare fully, like in the few time I do usually. But at the same time, if you rely on on some good synthesis, if you have even some reference to the actual sources and you read more versions, you get a lot of details that are by themselves already very, very important, and that can help you to reconstruct this all. And the impression I got from this battle, really, after having heard and read about it for a long time, actually looking at it in somewhat closer detail, made me realize that effectively it's the story of the total annihilation and of the complete disaster and of the total like butchery without any appeal of sort. If you look at how the thing unfolded on the field, well, it's very different from that. It was a very composite battle, and also one in which we can't really see what the hell happened in the first place at some levels. So this is pretty meaningful, and I hope it can serve to teach something about the fact that the first thing you should realize if you want to talk about history is that, first of all, that we don't know. I mean, that's seriously the only important thing, arguably. Because if you accept that, you accept the fact that this is just an interpretation on the base of evidence that is canny, that is biased, that actually does contain precious information, but it's not the truth. Because guess what? Nothing is... I mean, the truth, as I always say, does exist, but getting there with our poor gnosiological means is a wholly different thing, right? And specifically, by definition, nobody knows what happened for real, in the sense that here there is not the best historian who can get to the reality because he's you know, he can invent what happened. Like, we have just these sources, so you can do a better or worse analysis, but at the end of the day, you literally don't know. So even people who take these battles as this is a definitive thing, right? It's reality. We should concentrate on hardcore, like as if it was like a dogma. Those people are not making history, right? They are completely out of reality, of the historical reality that we know as such. As they think that instead they hold a historical truth that historically, in fact, does not exist by definition. Alright, so I think we can stop it here. I hope we will keep talking, of course, about crusading warfare, and there's a chance even for me to expand my knowledge in this stuff, because I as I was saying in the beginning, I've never gotten totally interested in them as such, but I realized that, I mean, if you study them, especially from a military point of view, and you leave aside all the garbage about, politics and, dogmatic interpretation, you think that here religion is the only thing that counts as a pattern of interpretation, and you're completely out of medieval historical reality. Like, this is not more a religiously driven thing than another historical context, right? The old Middle Ages were religiously driven, but together with lots of other things, but people just like to narrow it down exclusively to religion. And that's why effectively also they largely don't understand anything about the history of the Crusades. But aside from this, I mean, if you look at the specificity, even the technicalities of medieval warfare in the Crusader states, in the Holy Land, you discover such a huge depth of this world that really makes you understand it in a much more humble, rational, concrete, objective way than ideological interpretations do, right? So yeah, this is my take on it, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. I thank you for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.